right, everybody. So today on the podcast, we have Dr. Dean St. Mart. How we doing, man?
I'm very good, Dave. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm very privileged to have been asked.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm very, very glad to get you on here. So we'll dive into your background and everything. But as with all episodes, we start with a charity donation. And the one people have probably heard me mention the most is Operation Smile. They help children with cleft lip and palate surgeries. And so there's always a link below for anybody who wants to contribute. Obviously, I have a dental background, and so I've done most of the work with them. I'm glad to continue to support them. So you have a PhD in organic chemistry, and we were just chatting a little bit about how you work basically as an engineer. And I have seen you more recently in the last probably 1 to 2 years. I've seen you pop up more. I've seen other people reference you on there. I forget, I might have even seen you mentioned on a forum. But let's just give a little bit of background if somebody hasn't heard of you about how you get on into this space.
Like you said, I'm Dr. Dean St. Mart. I have a PhD in synthetic organic chemistry, and my background in terms of my undergrad was chemistry and pharmaceutical chemistry. So basically pharmacology and drug design. After the degree, I pursued synthetic chemistry because there's just a huge passion of being able to synthesize, new drugs and being able to apply this wonderful chemistry to progress mankind. But I started to realize that when we look at, conventional medicine and even conventional science, when we're looking at drug design, it's always, we've got a set of symptoms and let's target drugs to those symptoms. It was never really thought upon when I was doing my research anyway, or when I was sitting in on research groups from the chemistry department of, we've got, for example, say diabetes. Diabetes drugs are there to either manage blood glucose issues or to help the pancreas. It's never to go to the root cause of why the diabetes started in the first place. We're always just trying to improve patient lifestyles with medication. And I started to become a little disjunct from that sort of thought process. And that's where I started to get more into looking at functional medicine. And at the time I was bodybuilding, and I started to see even in the realm of bodybuilding, pharmacology of bodybuilding, some of the stuff that was being said there wasn't even correct science, and how bodybuilders were looking at their health overall wasn't really that functional. So when I finished my PhD, I'd no real desire to go into pure science and chemical research, more so for the fact that you're chasing funding and you're trying to. We don't have the problem in Europe with like tenure of getting a space. You can basically get your own space in a university fairly easy, provided you get continuous funding. And I just seen during my PhD that, my two supervisors were constantly chasing after governing bodies to get more money to keep the labs going. And you could tell that even their passion for science was dwindling a little bit because it was just trying to keep your head above water. And so I moved into chemical engineering with Intel, and I stayed there for 8 years. And during that time, that was sort of when my passion into functional medicine and like functional pharmacology really developed. And that was to support my own bodybuilding journey. And 5 years ago, a friend of mine, he started a supplement company. And so I'd already been, looking at how you can use functional medicine to, say, support sleep. What's the mechanisms behind why we fall asleep and stay asleep? What are some of the nutritional components, supplement components that we can use, rather than, going the pharmacology aspect of basically you've got these GABA receptors in your brain that tell your brain to calm down and shut off, which is what, a lot of sleep medicines work on. But it basically just tells your brain to switch off. You don't actually go to the process of sleep. Mm-hmm. And for me, with such a high-end job and high-stress job, adding bodybuilding on top and prepping for bodybuilding shows, I had to figure out how to support my sleep with doing, day shifts and night shifts alternating. So you had like shifty rotations that you couldn't turn around to your boss and go, well, I didn't sleep too good during today for tonight shift, and then something breaks down and it's running at, say, like a $2.5 million an hour production rate that every second is, thousands upon thousands of dollars being wasted.
Right.
So that was where I started to delve into, how we can use supplements to address health issues from a functional perspective. And that then, I guess, branched into how can I support bodybuilders' health? And that's sort of where I probably become a bit more familiar in that space of trying to educate bodybuilders on when they use, say, anabolic steroids. We've become synonymous, and obviously this sort of stigma of anabolic steroids cause heart disease, but it really, it's not as simple as that sort of mindset within the general population. If you take steroids, you're going to die of a heart attack.
Sure.
There's all these other processes underneath and other functional aspects that there's lifestyle management, nutrition management, antioxidant supplementation. All these things play into the bigger picture that anabolic steroids probably set the scene for you to have cardiovascular disease at some point in your life, but it's the other aspects that sort of augment that process. And it's getting to that functional medicine thought process of trying to get bodybuilders to think, well, if this is the root cause of why this disease happens, how can I put plans in place to protect myself and protect my future health from the choices I'm going to make with this sort of lifestyle? So that's obviously, again, with supplement needs, I started to look at, a liver stack, a kidney and blood pressure stack, a heart stack, looking at ingredients within the literature that had a good efficacy at the correct dosages in order to keep male, it was more so for male bodybuilders, but it's now sort of branching into the female realm as well. Of how I can keep these guys healthy with their choices and hopefully, save some lives where guys aren't dying prematurely in their late 30s, early 40s from silly mistakes they might make in their 20s.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting to see, how things have shifted. And so when I mean, like I mentioned before the podcast, I've been lifting forever. But I was really interested in going, I have no, I guess, like allegiance to people who are just like forever natural and they have this like pride about it. Like, I don't really care. For me, it's just a health thing. Like, I just wouldn't want to go down that route. I think there's a lot of emotion that goes into most people's decision to get on anabolics, and then they don't think about the consequences long term.
Yeah.
So that is my biggest reason, but if somebody's like, hey, here's a supplement / whatever that had no side effects and would put on 10 pounds of muscle, I'm not going to be like, no. Like, that's just not. So, yeah. But to me, I just think most people don't think about it. Right. And they jump on very early. They don't push themselves. Like, I've seen pictures of you naturally and you got very far. Right. I mean, you had an impressive physique.
Yeah. I mean, before even that realm, my sort of natural off-season weight got up to 225 pounds. So, wow. And like, I mean, I could deadlift 200 kilos. I could squat 200 kilos. The only thing that I'm rubbish at and always have been rubbish at is bench pressing or any sort of pressing. I could press, what's the most I've ever done? 65, 150 kilos. So whatever that is in pounds, maybe 300 and something pounds, is it? Yeah.
So, well, I mean, proportionally though, I think that's pretty good. I mean, this was all around the same time, and this is when you were natural, you were saying?
Yeah. And I mean, that sort of follows, it's sort of an old school mentality, but it's always like, bench 3 plates, squat 4 plates, deadlift 5 plates was sort of what the old school method was how far you can test your natural strength limit for the average person.
Yeah, sure.
And so this is another thing that I've become notorious about, is like speaking openly about just not even the idiocy, but just the complete lack of science behind what's being prescribed. And prescribed is the right term to use with what's being said online. Guys are being told, take this amount of drugs. It's never rooted in science. And I mean, even for someone who's looking to enter into this realm, there's never a consideration towards where like their natural testosterone level is, even to begin with. So you could have someone who's, for example, the top end of the natural scale. So for us, it's like 30, 32 nanomole, which I think is about 1,000 nanograms per deciliter for the US measurement. They'll never ever have their blood work done to see where they sit naturally. And then they'll listen to some arbitrary person online say, oh, take 500 milligrams of testosterone. Mm-hmm. Now, that level in terms of plasma level achievement of testosterone from that dose could be somewhere around 150 nanomoles. So that's like 5 times their natural production. Now, if we take someone who's on the opposite end of the spectrum, who's potentially technically hypogonadal, and their test level is maybe 10 nanomole, which is like 380 nanograms per deciliter. If they take the same dose of 500 milligrams and their test level goes to 150, that's 15 times what they're making naturally. It didn't make sense to me that we should be, like anything, it should be a personal protocol if that's what way we want to call it. But it should be an intelligent basis that if this is a choice that someone's going to make, the obvious thing or solution to do here is take what you make naturally and either double or triple it and see what happens and assess what benefits come from it or what side effects come from it. Is it really what you think it's going to be? Because, you often see arguments that dose for someone who's at the very top of the natural range at 30 nanomole, that might take them to 90 nanomole, which would be like, 400 milligrams, 350, 400 milligrams. They might view that as a low dose compared to what's being said to them online. But by going to that sort of triple their natural level, they're able to assess, in a controlled manner, what is happening, I guess, from a biochemical basis and also from a metabolic perspective, so that they're not creating too much estrogen, they're not creating too much DHT. What are the mental side effects? Because it influences how our brains operate and our neurochemistry. You take that same approach for someone who's at the very bottom and they're sitting at 8 nanomole. If we triple their natural testosterone level, it falls at 24 nanomole, which is effectively still within that natural range. It's somewhere around 800 nanograms per deciliter. 900 nanograms. Mm-hmm. If that person was to say to someone, I'm doing a steroid cycle, and they go, yeah, what are you taking? And they turn around and said, 125 milligrams of testosterone, they'd be laughed at.
Right.
But, they've, again, the sort of opposite spectrum, they've tripled their natural testosterone to 24 nanomole from 8. If they can't progress with triple the amount of testosterone in their plasma, that might not necessarily mean there's triple the amount of free testosterone, but we've tripled the amount of testosterone in your body. You're still within the natural range. And if you're turning around saying that I don't have greater nitrogen retention or greater DHT in my body and all that sort of stuff that comes with it, then did you really push yourself when you were a natural in terms of the other optimization of nutrition, recovery, sleep, training volume, etc.? And that's where I've sat and been devil's advocate of trying to show people that we can't be taking these generic prescriptions, that it has to be centered around that person's biochemistry. And if anything, with that first exposure, it literally is a test in the water of doubling or tripling the level and allowing that person to assess, is this for me, rather than going straight in at like 10, 15 times their natural level, where it just becomes this hormonal mess.
Right. Yeah. I agree. I'll play devil's advocate to that, and then I'll kind of see where I mostly agree with you. So like, I can understand why there are these blanket prescriptions, because if you look at in medicine, right, a lot of the time it is just a blanket recommendation. You had breast cancer, Femara, 2.5 milligrams every day, right? You have an infection, amoxicillin, 500 milligrams 3 times a day, et cetera. Even like from biologics, right? Like vedolizumab for ulcerative colitis, 300 milligrams every 8 weeks. So these are oftentimes not based on the individual, and that's just how they're studied. And that could just be due to ease of use, right? Because it's probably just easier for these companies to do that. But with that said, I think logically, based on what you're saying, like, why wouldn't you, especially, I mean, most of these people are not getting it from a doctor, unfortunately, but whether you are or not, why wouldn't you just be a little bit more patient. And I think patience is the big thing here, right? Where just you could titrate it up and see how you feel. And going back to the emotional aspect I mentioned earlier, I think of when I was in college and, I had a few friends taking some things and it's like, I need 10 pounds now versus like me having lifted for 18 years. If I was going to go that route, I'd probably love to say, okay, 100 milligrams, then maybe 150, maybe, because I'm so used to nothing happening, But I think when you're young, you just like, I need it all now.
Yeah. And that is another big issue we face in today's environment, like you said, with young people not taking the time or being naive to the negative aspects or the health consequences, and more so, I keep saying this, and it's sort of becoming a not a boring thing to say, but social media is becoming a sort of onslaught of people seeing other people's progress and going, oh, he must take that, when, it might not be the reality, but they're looking again for this instant gratification of, I need that 10 pounds of tissue right now.
Mm-hmm.
The whole empirical dosing that you said there, that is funny. If you read into the research, there's a really nice paper from, I think it's 2010, by I think it's a woman, Chella is her second name, and they go into why we sort of do this sort of dosing of milligram per kilogram dosing within a medical basis. Obviously, for pediatrics is another area where milligram per kilogram or standardized dosing is set. And she basically like breaks it down as like almost laziness, that we have this way of, being theoretical in our approach towards pharmacology from a chemistry perspective and the number of molecules in a certain dose and whatever else. And we can do that from an individual patient perspective, but from a time management, if you've got like hundreds of patients to see, it's very easy to just go, right, 500 milligrams 3 times a day, there's your prescription, instead of sitting down and working out.
Yeah, exactly. Sure.
That body weight is so many molecules and so many receptors. And even then, you get down into body weight itself. We don't have a correlation, and more body weight means more receptors in the body, so more drug is needed. It just comes down to the standard prescription. And, that's sort of where I guess I'm trying to come at the PD realm again, from that functional sort of thought process of let's do this in as logical way as possible. That's a controlled environment where we can then understand when a problem arises during that, I guess, testing period, allows that person to understand, well, going forward, if they go in with such a huge dose and there's just a huge generation of even, for example, estrogen, that again might be just from a genetic perspective, that had they started slowly, like you said, and you move the dose up slower and slower, you then come to a point where potentially that aromatase conversion is happening at a higher constant rate, that if they had to enter at a low level, they might not have even noticed that side effect. So yeah, there's pros and cons to both, definitely.
Yeah. Do you think there's something to be said for, sometimes I'll see research, and it's research that a lot of times I see naturals focus on, that they say, hey, within the physiological range, it doesn't make much of a difference, which I think is flawed, as you already said. But do you think there is something to be said for getting above that range? The reason I ask is because I have clients who are on TRT, and oftentimes we see these reports where they're in the normal range, and maybe they started at 300 nanograms per deciliter, and they say, my libido is higher, I feel better, but I really haven't noticed much, if any, increase in muscle mass. Whereas almost nobody does like a legitimate cycle and says, well, I'm just not gaining any muscle. I mean, I'm sure it exists, but you don't see that much. So do you think there's something to be said for just getting over a certain number?
I guess, we can't deny with androgens, there is, we've done the quote unquote research with the likes of Bashin et al. That, as we have a dose response, as you increase the dose of testosterone, more muscle mass is gained to a point. I don't think they've ever gone beyond 600, 700 milligrams in a controlled environment towards testosterone exposure. For someone who's on like true physiological TRT, again, it comes back to their genetic baseline, like I said. So if this TRT is a true mimic that prior to potentially being hypogonadal, so whether that's secondary from the brain or primary from the testes, if that TRT dose is mimicking exactly where they sort of developed during adulthood, then I don't think you're going to see anything crazy beyond what probably would have happened naturally without the TRT. Mm-hmm. It's when you start taking that example of, like I said, someone who was, primary hypogonadism has occurred and their test level was, say, 8 nanomole, which is like 300 nanograms roughly. If their TRT prescription of like 100, 125 milligrams, which is sort of standard TRT 125 to 150, if that level now has brought them from 300 to, 750, which is still in the physiological realm, there's now, like I said, triple the exposure, triple the level of testosterone present. So now we have more androgen receptors being activated versus when they were natural. We've higher potential rates of DHT formation, so the nervous system's being nourished. Tensile strength within the nervous system is improved. That's when you start to see that they're within this physiological realm before they're given genetics of where they developed during life. It's actually super physiological exposure. And this is what I'm trying to get guys to view, that even if you're on controlled TRT and you're still in this physiological realm, if your previous physiological baseline, is down at that sort of 308 nanomole region, and now you're being pushed up, double or triple where you sort of sat naturally all your life, there's cause to then even caution that you are, quote unquote, on a super physiological dose of androgens, even though you're within the physiological range.
Right.
And that becomes a very gray area going forward, that you've now tripled that person's exposure to their natural testosterone. So is that the same sort of risk to health as, say, someone who is in the physiological range naturally? This is where I'm getting at with the sort of high-end natural range of 30, and now they're using 500 milligrams and they've gone to 90 or 120. They've again tripled the amount of testosterone being exposed to their body. So is the health risk akin between the 24 nanomole, where they've tripled it from a low level, to the 30 that they've tripled it to 90 or 100? So this is something that I've seen, no comparative research on, but from a theoretical basis, it's definitely something that people need to be aware of, even going down the path of hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah. So what do you suspect the answer is? Because to be honest, I would suspect that it's not the same. I would have a hard time believing somebody who's bringing their levels up from 200 to 600 is going to have the same health issues as somebody going from 900 to 2700. And
that comes down to, I believe, the same there, based on the fact that from a number of molecules perspective, you've just a huge dose. So obviously when we look at dose in terms of molecular number and then molecular interactions, that higher dose has far greater volume of molecular interactions to the lower dose. And those molecular interactions then happen elsewhere in the body. So that's where the health dysfunction comes from anabolic steroid use, is when these androgen receptors in tissue outside skeletal muscle become activated and cause gene transcription that leads to potential skews in their lipid metabolism. So their cholesterol gets skewed, or their liver metabolism and how their liver enzymes turn over, or how they, excrete, metabolize xenobiotics or, exogenous compounds from their body. That, yes, the higher dose in theory is more androgen receptor activations than the controlled, lower physiological dose. But still interesting to me that that's assuming that when you triple that person's natural testosterone level, that full tripling of that amount of testosterone results in all that testosterone just going to skeletal muscle cells as well. So it's so broad that it's never been studied. Yeah, but it's definitely a conversation that people need to understand, especially with how mainstream TRT and hormone optimization is becoming within society now. That you have guys who are utilizing TRT to improve quality of life, and that's amazing. But there's never, it's always viewed that, okay, your test is within this sort of green bracket on your blood work. So my health is going to be, it shouldn't be the same as someone who's on cycle. And what I'm trying to get around is that may not be exactly the case, depending on that baseline exposure and then where that higher dose is going in the body.
Yeah, no, it's very, I've never heard anybody else really frame it like that. I'm trying to think if physiologically I can think of anything else where that would be the case. Like, for instance, if somebody naturally had an LDL of 50, right? I don't think somebody who had an LDL of 150, you'd then say, well, if they bumped it up to 150, it'd be the same as the other person bumping it up to 450, right? Like there is, it seems like physiologically there are these, I don't want to say absolute numbers, but a range where we do seem to function best. But again, I love the critical thinking, and like, just because nobody's really, as far as I know, kind of phrased it like that. Like maybe there's something to it, even if it's not a literal 3 times or whatever.
Yeah, because where this sort of thought process actually started to dawn on me was, I started to see a lot of sexual dysfunction in guys who had recovered their HPTA post anabolic use. So we're talking going from a super high, super physiological level of testosterone and recovering the hypothalamus and pituitary and testicle back to where it was prior to exposure. Blood work looks absolutely perfect. So their LH and FSH, the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, are optimal again, their blood work. So it's back to where it was baseline. So we know that the production of their fertility hormones is optimal in the brain. And the testes are responding appropriately by making the same amount of testosterone as they did prior to the exposure of that testosterone dose. But now you have sexual dysfunction in terms of loss of libido, erectile dysfunction, loss of vitality to life, loss of drive. And then we start to view that, super physiological levels of androgens have other effects in the body, and, most notably towards neurochemistry. So while, a guy goes on TRT and feels great and feels energized again, feels more driven, we know that, the turnover of dopamine in the brain is associated with testosterone, because we see that association on how prolactin is manipulated by dopamine, and obviously dopamine is manipulated by testosterone. That post-use, we know that the neurons of our brain have an electrical potential. So you've basically gone from a level where the brain has become so used to being stimulated by a high concentration of dopamine because of this high level of testosterone, that when that high level of testosterone has been ceased, the neuron's potential, the electrical potential of that neuron to operate isn't being achieved because of that lower physiological dose of testosterone. And now we have a brain that, for all intents and purposes, physiologically the person's in perfect health in their blood work, but the brain, the electrochemistry of the brain is completely changed because of that neural sensitivity to that elevated hormone has changed. And that, in my mind, is probably one of the driving factors of androgen abuse. So you have a young 22-year-old, 24-year-old who's abused a steroid cycle, has had immense libido, immense vitality of life, and then has ceased their cycle, recovered back to natural physiology, and now they're complaining to their general practitioner of, they've no drive, no libido, very difficulty waking up in the morning. But for all intents and purposes, their physiology from their blood work, the general practitioner is looking and going, well, there's nothing wrong. Your HPTA is functioning perfectly. The neurochemistry is completely changed, and that neural potential, we don't really have a time period on how long it takes for that neural threshold, that electrical potential of that neuron to relax back to where it was at the normal physiological level of testosterone. So now you have a person that views that when they were on cycle, they had amazing libido and amazing drive for life. And so the thought process that comes into the head is quite often, I'm just going to go back using steroids because that had me feeling amazing. And it becomes this sort of perpetual cycle that you then get into the muddy waters of, is that, chemical substance dependency? Is it, physical dependency? Is it, there's just, it becomes very gray in that, are these addictive substances from both a physical standpoint and an emotional standpoint.
Sure.
And it's something that I'm hoping, and if not, I would love to do some published controlled research on this. So it would have to be case studies. But I've seen, from private consultation as a pharmacologist, several guys who have come to me, and then when we've delved a little deeper into dry urinary testing, where we're looking at neurotransmitter metabolism in their urine, their levels of homovanillate and the metabolites of dopamine and the other neurotransmitter serotonin are completely skewed. And we're able to understand then that low hormone, or what you could say is that normal low hormone environment, because you're getting muddied up here again, because the person's back to where they were physiologically to begin with, naturally, but it's low for their body and their brain. That the reversal of that neural potential, electrical chemical signal, takes just time to come back to where it was previously, because it's not getting stimulated anymore. That the neurons excitability calms down back to where it was when you were
I imagine you would
level.
Surmise that is proportional to the amount of time that they were on.
It quite possibly would be, and the exposure to obviously the elevated level of dopamine. So obviously the brain is seeking out this high level of dopamine. But the problem here then is we're in a society where dopamine driven behavior is quite high. So the brain is constantly getting stimulated to try and secrete dopamine from, whether it's social media or, pornography, all these sort of things that are muddied within general society, that in order for that person's brain to calm down to where it was prior to that exposure, they have to try and abstain from dopamine seeking behavior to allow the brain to stop trying to secrete dopamine as much as possible. And that again just becomes a cycle where they're constantly flipping between being off, feeling not right, and their blood's being fine, to going back on and having that sort of mental clarity and libido again.
I imagine this is happening relatively quickly, because if you could imagine a situation where somebody jumps on at 20 years old and now they're 30, you see this sometimes with like finasteride, post-finasteride syndrome as well. And people say, well, things are so much worse. Well, it's okay, but you're also 10 years older. But it sounds like you're talking about in a shorter time frame, maybe even like a year or something.
I'm talking like a year to a year and a half, depending on the length of exposure. So if someone has abused for a continuous length of time without that sort of return to physiological level, the dependency on that sort of neurochemistry, I've seen it quite a lot. And it's sort of almost an unspoken thing about. In recent times, it started to be termed androgen steroid induced hypogonadism, ASIH, where all intents and purposes, the person is operating physiologically. So the brain is making LH and LH perfectly fine again. But the body, or more so the neurochemistry, is being starved of androgens. So technically the brain is hypogonadal. Right.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I guess I'm sure there's no real data out there, but maybe on your experience, how long does it take people to do they ever get back to normal?
So I've only had one sort of successful outcome where someone actually listened to me in this regard to abstain from dopamine seeking behavior and to really correct that dysfunction. And for that person, it took 2.5 years before they regained what you'd consider, normal libido, normal sexual function, normal sexual stimulation, because obviously dopamine is sort of what drives sexual stimulation in the male. So when dopamine levels are high in the brain, that's when we get sexually aroused. And then obviously we orgasm when it hits a peak. For this person, it took 2.5 years of leading quite a boring life, and they admit, they admitted that that was a rough 2.5 years of, trying to abstain from any sort of thrill-seeking behavior, and just basically to understand that it's not like neuroinflammation, but it's almost like you're trying to get the brain to calm down and allow that synapse signaling to operate at a lower threshold. And that, to me, we really understand how cardiovascular disease impacts bodybuilders, in terms of what androgen receptor activation or steroid use does towards their lipoprotein and oxidative stress. It's the neurochemical side that I think in the next sort of 10 to 15 years, with this sort of social media trend and what we're seeing happening now with young kids, like you said, where they're making irrational decisions, we will probably see like not a mental health crisis, but a crisis whereby these sort of neural deficits become quite apparent within emergency medicine and, general practitioner.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the most interesting aspects of it, and one of the things that would scare me the most, because obviously, like, I mean, you start to lose your mind and like your brain power and all of that. It's very scary to think of going down that route. I think the first paper I saw posted on that, I saw it a few years ago. I don't know how old it is, but it started to show. It was basically saying there was some brain damage, or I don't want to misquote it, so maybe I'll link the paper. I'm sure you've seen it, but basically just saying that there was some damage in performance enhancing drug users. And that's scary to think about, because we just don't know that much about it. It's not like, hey, well, I can take a statin or I can take an ARB and I can kind of protect, the cardiovascular system. I don't imagine that we have a lot of evidence for things to protect that.
No, I think the only thing that we can maybe make an assumption towards, or a hypothesis towards, is oxidative stress and protecting neurons from being damaged by free radicals. And obviously, the issue here is, if anyone doesn't realize, when you damage a neuron in your brain, we don't have neurogenesis. We don't have neurogeneration properties, that when a neuron is effectively damaged, we can't repair it. What ends up happening is we have neural branching, where your synapses, your brain can basically start sending stems out from other neurons to try and make connections. So rather than having a higher number of neurons in the brain, you've got greater connections. So it's almost like you've got 5 telephone lines, and now one of them has broke. So now you're branching, telephone line 1 and 2 to try and take the same volume of calls that 5 would have taken. But it's still not at the same speed as if you had that free telephone line, that once that neuron's effectively dysfunctional, it's useless. The brain just ignores it and tries to branch off to try and send signals as fast as it can. We've got very limited data towards brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, and that sort of became a hype thing within the supplement realm, and the sort of supplement influencer online of take this supplement to increase BDNF, and people pushing the likes of lion's mane and ginkgo biloba, stuff that we know have what you could say mild neural protection properties. Again, they're acting as antioxidants. They're just trying to protect the neuron from being damaged by superoxide or hydrogen peroxide, whatever free radicals being made by our cells. And there really, like you said, there really isn't anything that you can tell someone that you take this supplement every day if you're a steroid user and your brain's going to be fine. Right. And that paper that you said, it's probably the same paper. It's a case controlled study where they done IQ tests between people who didn't take nandrolone and people who did take nandrolone. Mm-hmm. And they found the IQ that those who used nandrolone was much lower than the non-users. Now, it's not the most accurate in terms of study design, because you can't say that these, I think it was 6 and 6, that these 12 people are of equal intelligence prior to anabolic steroid exposure. So you can never control. For all they were trying to test here was spatial awareness and spatial reasoning. was different in the 6 people who used nandrolone versus those who didn't. And we start to understand that.
Well, I was going to say, because like we've mostly talked about testosterone, and that obviously itself can cause problems, but I would imagine that some of these other drugs that people take, maybe it's even more so amplified.
Yeah, we definitely see there was one study, but again, we don't have any human controlled studies. So what we really tend to try and rely on is animal models here to try and understand what happens in an animal model and what's the likelihood of extrapolating that same data to humans, which, for the likes of rats, rabbits are sort of case controlled animals with similar genetics. We're able to form hypotheses, but never ever say conclusively, this is what's happening. But there's a paper that they studied baldenone or equipoise or EQ, whatever way you want to call it, in rabbits. And we found quite a large increase in oxidative stress towards oxidative stress markers in the blood. And correspondingly, then when you administer, an antioxidant alongside baldenone, you see this drop in oxidative stress as a protection strategy in quotes that we're trying to offset some of that damage that's being induced. More so probably as a result of probably cellular efficiency. So your mitochondria are probably making more free radicals as a consequence of energy turnover. And without, supporting that internal antioxidant system, we start to see that dysfunction. So if the person's not, supplementing with more so nutritionally from vitamin E, vitamin C, vitamin A, what the cell uses naturally to protect itself as a sacrificial molecule, that's when the dysfunction sets in.
Sure. Yeah. I did actually find the study. I think I can send it to you in the chat here. Let me see. Did that pop up on your end there?
It did, yeah. Let's open up here.
So for people listening, titled Long-Term Anabolic Androgenic Steroid Use is Associated with Deviant Brain Aging. This was in 2021. So May 2020.
Last year. And that's probably, if you do like a PubMed study and you search related articles, I'm fairly certain that the nandrolone one, if we even go down to the references, I think I read this last year.
Yeah.
It'll reference the paper about the
yeah. So I'll definitely link this below for people interested, but just a quick conclusions. The findings suggest long-term high dose AAS use may have adverse effects on brain aging, potentially linked to dependency and exaggerated use of AAS. So again, I read the study, but it is just interesting to see more people talk about it and more of that coming out, because I don't think that was really ever talked about, other than people talking about like roid rage, but I don't think people really ever talked about it before.
Yeah, and I mean, what really sort of led me down this path of research was more so seeing that sexual dysfunction post use of like harsh androgens like trembolone that we know have a really high affinity for the androgen receptor, and the potential, again, from animal research, the neurotoxicity that comes from these 19-nor testosterone derivatives, that again is that dopamine issue post trembolone use as a consequence of destroying neurons that help with dopamine signaling, so you're not transmitting dopamine as fast enough compared to the electrical potential issue. Without an accurate brain scan, you can't really say that that region of neurons are damaged or not. But this is sort of an area that I would really like to see androgen researchers start broadening their base into. But again, this would be more so research that's aimed towards not even safer use, to offset use, to try and educate and warn of the dangers mainstream, that the consequences of these compounds, are they really worth effectively, like you said there a minute ago, losing your mind?
Yeah. Do you think that, because I know you've talked before about not just, hey, coming off anabolics, but actually avoiding thrill-seeking behavior and things like that. Do you think that that's just kind of becoming this more like global issue with people, because obviously more and more there's social media and TikTok. Like I refuse to download TikTok. And somebody said, I forget who it was, but they said, well, no, you should download it. It's like, it's really funny, or you'd really like it. And to me, it's like, I'm not saying I wouldn't like it. I just don't want to go down that path, because I'm already pretty obsessed with my phone. Like, I'm always on my phone. There's just always some stimulation, or I feel like I could be listening to something, reading something. I want to always be productive.
Yeah.
So I have a hard time stepping back and actually setting time to like just be by myself or meditate or things like that,
Yeah, I'm probably the same type of personality. It definitely is the culture of the environment. But again, you have to sort of view what way you're utilizing that environment, like you said. So you're probably like me, that you're probably on your phone all the time, but it's always from a learning objective. So you're looking at things on social media that add value to your life, that you're learning something new, you're reading something new, you're in pursuit of knowledge, as opposed to pursuit of constant entertainment and
Correct,
constant, stimulation from an entertainment perspective. And so I think it really depends on, again, is that a personality trait, or is that, just something that we understand? We have this very powerful tool now that at our disposal. We've reached to millions of people that are sharing information daily that we can access and improve our lives with. It's definitely, again, it's such a broad thing to try and even consider, because you might have the other side, that someone goes on androgen use and becomes like a sexual deviant. And you have the other side where someone goes on androgen use and becomes the most productive entrepreneur you can imagine, because of how driven their brain is at making these decisions towards being, highly motivated, high vitality, wants to succeed, as opposed to seeking out enjoyment from the other leisurely aspects of what dopamine brings. So definitely we are in an environment that, unfortunately, yes, social media, phones are going to be a part of our lives, but our children's lives. I've got two young boys that I've often had this conversation with my wife, that, one's 3 and one's 1, that for as long as possible, I want my kids to remain kids. I don't want them to get sucked into the realm of social media from we see now kids who are 6, 7, 8, 9 on TikTok and having phones and interacting through social media with phones, that to me we don't need to be upsetting their neurochemistry from that age of seeking that. They have plenty of other realms of stimulation to develop from. That it definitely adds to it that you have kids who are probably obtaining a phone with social media at, say, age 12, 13, and by the time they reach 16, 17, they fall prey to not so much image abuse, but that they feel they have to look this way, and they're looking at they're training in gyms, and then they're looking at bigger guys who maybe, I often tell this anecdote on podcasts, but like whenever I go train at the gym at my parents live about 3 hours from where we live. There's a high school, a secondary level school beside the gym. And one day I'd finished training and I was getting changed. And this group of 5, 16-year-olds came in. And as I was getting changed, one of them turned to me, and his first thing he said to me was, "Hey, mister, what do you take?" and I just stood there and I laughed, and I said, "Why, what makes you think that?" And he goes, "I just want to know what you take, mister." I said, "Well, for one thing, I'm training 14 years. I've very rarely missed training, and I've very rarely missed a meal. Can you guys say the same there?" "Oh yeah, but it's all about what you take. It's not, And I'm like, no. Take it from me.
That's interesting.
You want to end up where I am, in my early 30s, at double your age, healthily. Forget about these things of what do you take and what supplement and what magic thing is there, because I said it doesn't exist, and all you're going down is a health trap."
It's wild to think it starts that young. Like, because I mean, and again, maybe that's a social media change, but I didn't really, I mean, I'm sure it existed in my high school, but I didn't really see it until college. I don't know anybody in high school who was doing it. Again, I'm sure it existed, but
Yeah, and even for myself, I couldn't say to you like whatever it was 17, 18 years ago when I was finishing our high school. I could have said, oh, that guy in my year is clearly on steroids because there was no one.
yeah,
And you know, the other harsh reality is, had that person who'd come into the change room been someone who had a different mindset to me and they were in that sort of drug culture or they sold steroids, if that, for all intents and purposes, child, 16-year-old, asks that person, what do you take? All of a sudden you just take out a bag of stuff and go, oh, what do you want, lads? And it's, you know, it's scary because it's that accessible as well.
yeah,
You know, we probably were in an era where it was sort of like a closed environment that was sort of like a who's who. And, you know, if any average person come in off the street into a gym and said, I'm looking to buy steroids, to be thrown out of the gym.
right.
It was almost like an inner circle thing of you were at that level of bodybuilding where guys went, okay, yes, without any sort of reasoning to science, but they sort of went, okay, your physique is at a level that if you're considering this, then okay, we'll sort you with stuff. It's not like now where it's just like, what do you have?
Right,
what can I buy from you? And all of a sudden you have 16-year-olds taking Winstrol, Anavar, Danabol, you know, oral steroids because they can just put the pot in their bag and their parents don't even know they're taking it.
Right. Yeah.
Like we had a 17-year-old die in Ireland in 2018. It was publicly announced all over the newspapers and media. Was completing his final exams to finish high school to go to university, and had been doing 7 different types of sports on top of being like a high achieving student. And secretly unknown to the parents had been taking Winstrol as an anabolic agent to help whatever he was told by whoever, that would be a sport and performance compound. Died of a stroke, huge amounts of oxidative stress to the brain. Now, is that because of the environment and the high stress? Because in Ireland, our like final student exams to finish high school to get into university is quite stressful. You have to, you know, study 8 subjects and you have exams on all 8 subjects, and it can be an extremely tense time for those who want to achieve highly, because it's based on a point system based on what your grades get. Each grade is worth X amount of points. Was it that stressful environment of the schoolwork with all the sporting, and then the added use of Winstrol pushed that oxidative stress in the brain beyond a point that was recoverable? We've got, you know, someone who may not be following nutritional strategies, supplemental strategies, etc. It becomes very murky there. But here we have a 17-year-old who got open access to oral steroids without their parents even realizing until it was too late.
Yeah, that's crazy young. I mean, you know, so what's the guy's name? Dave Palumbo, I feel like kind of does a disservice sometimes because he's always saying that it's genetics, and he almost discounts the use of these drugs. So I definitely don't want to come across like that at all. But man, if you die of a stroke at 17, there's got to be some contributing factors there.
Yeah, and I mean it's like I said, it's just worrying that first-hand experience of kids asking, "What do you take?" It's almost like where's that behavior been learned? Like we said, where are they getting that thought process of steroids are what create that physique? When, you know, we should commend that there's open access here to knowledge surrounding, you know, it's not as taboo or it's not as stigmatic as it was in the past. But is that sort of open use? Like we have guys who have vlogs on YouTube, you know, taking out bottles and going, well, this is what I take, and this is the dose I'm using, and look at me, I'm in great health. You have kids mirroring that where they go, oh, that guy is using 600 milligrams of tren, and you're thinking, what? You know, we go on about censorship that's surrounding social media now in current times, that stuff like that, you can't control it because that's that person's own life and that's that person's own choice. But we're getting to a point where that behavior then on an influential scale, and this applies to anything that we see on social media towards influential behavior. Can we blame that person for being influential and doing what they want to do with their life versus, someone deciding, well, I'm going to copy what that person's doing? It's becoming a very difficult environment to control going forward for our, I guess for me anyway, for my children's sake, of, what is openly being allowed to be displayed that perhaps would have been behind closed doors. You wouldn't have been, you could have a vlogger like that living on your street, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, he uses steroids. You might not have even known 10 years ago that he was using steroids, simply because he was all over YouTube earning money from that. It's definitely something that, in terms of education, it's trying to get above that entertaining noise with a serious message to this younger generation of slow down, get the basics correct, and then, like I said, at the start of the podcast, have the adult conversation of what's potentially the most intelligent way, or most maybe scientifically correct way of going about this decision, once you understand every avenue before you go down that road.
Yep, for sure. Just circling back a little bit, you mentioned you have 2 young boys. And I've seen some people who are enhanced talk about this myth of it seems like people who have used tend to have more girls. And I've never seen any research on this at all. Do you think it's like completely bogus? I've seen some people put forth reasons as to why maybe that would be, but I have no idea.
I've seen this and the whole girl myth. And to make a joke, my wife would have liked a girl on the second child. And she had me convinced that we were having a girl on the second child. That we didn't find out what we were having both times. That when our second son was born, and they said it's a son, I'm staring there going, all right. Like completely shocked, taken aback, like in my head going into labor with my wife. I was convinced that this
why was
girl's
she so convinced it was a girl?
Yeah. Just a completely different pregnancy to the first. Complete different in terms of even like hormone physiology. And I was then convinced about 5 months into the pregnancy that, this is like elevated estrogen in her body, and the elevated estrogen is coming from a female baby. That I often see this, or the other sort of not myth, because I would never ever rule it out, but genetic issues of guys who are using like even TRT. Yes, we could probably extrapolate up to crazy anabolic steroid cycles, that if you're causing oxidative stress, your sperm is going to get oxidatively damaged, and there's potential there for birth defects if that sperm was to get damaged and pass its damaged DNA to the egg. But again, we've no published data there towards that you've got guys saying, if you conceive while you're on cycle, there's going to be, damage passed to the baby or to the fetus. Without sort of, going down the rabbit hole of epigenetics, of what genes are actively being transcribed at the time that sperm was produced, and what epigenetic traits are within that DNA of that sperm. Without even doing, research, you could never even say conclusively that you're damaging the health of that child by conceiving when on either, regardless of the sex and the whole passing of the X and Y chromosome.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess there's nothing else out there, but so you haven't seen any evidence that it's one or the other?
No, I've never seen that. Obviously we the thing that controls basically whether we have a boy or a girl is our sperm towards the egg. Sure. So it comes down to, I think it's just a common coincidence that, quote unquote, we've got more top level bodybuilders having females than males.
Yeah, I don't know the breakdown for Ronnie is like 8 kids. It's mostly daughters, I think, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I've seen that in the
Yeah.
documentary.
Um, so we're going just a little over an hour. I just want to ask you if you have time about the supplement company.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So, well, I'm glad to hear, you didn't say something like, hey, well, I have the supplement that's going to help all potential brain damage if you take anabolics or something, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the supplements? Like, what is the goal behind the supplement company? You talked about, I guess, the development of it and kind of getting it off the ground, but what are you trying to achieve with it?
So I've never understood why. Well, probably I can't. There is quite a lot of like charlatans to the supplement industry where people are like selling you snake oil and giving you all these health claims. I've been very open and transparent ever since my wife sort of pushed me onto social media about 6 years ago that if you're going to use supplements, for one thing, they're not an insurance policy. So they're never, ever going to prevent something from happening. What we're trying to leverage here is if there's deficits to nutrition or deficits to lifestyle, some certain supplements based on controlled research that's been done, we can say potentially this may help alleviate or prevent in some shape or form future disease by supporting your body's own internal biochemistry. I could never tell someone, we've like I said, we have a line of products that are designed to target health, such as like the CV stack, which is for heart health, the liver stack, which is to support how your bile flows through your liver and supports estrogen metabolism, and a kidney and blood pressure stack called Astrag Flow. How those three were sort of developed was looking at, what drives a lot of plaque formation, and it'd be, oxidative stress and oxidation of LDL. And, if you're not ensuring that you have adequate intake of vitamin E or other polyphenols in your diet, CV stack sort of fills that void. You've got typical bodybuilders that eat chicken and rice and some green veg. There's no colorful fruit. They're really missing out on some of the nuances to nutrition. So even then, we can argue that certain supplements don't even fill the same void as whole food because of the food matrix.
Sure.
But we're trying to offer, obviously, a solution here that you can augment potentially per nutritional practice or per lifestyle management with this supplement that is like 12 or 13 different antioxidants, a clinical dose of vitamin E in terms of being both the tocopherols and tocotrienols. So when I started out, a lot of these formulas that arrived with supplement needs were actually protocols I was doing myself personally. And one of the things that drove me nuts was having to buy 15 or 16 different bottles from different online retailers and spending time in the morning going, open that bottle, open that, and you're opening up all these bottles to take one capsule or two capsules or whatever it was. That I was like, surely this needs to be easier. That it's just one bottle, all 13 of them are in one bottle, and it's like 4 or 5 capsules and you're done. Unscrew the bottle, take out 5, take it. Not it's like spending 15 minutes opening all these bottles in the morning, or spending an hour on a Sunday filling up pill pots.
That's what I do.
And that's where the CV stack and the likes came from. Was this, there needs to be a solution here that we have one company, people go to it and go, right, CV stack has all these ingredients like CoQ10, astaxanthin, olive leaf extract, all these stuff that we know in research help towards supporting LDL metabolism and offsetting oxidation, and helping with how your liver produces HDL, say, like citrus bergamot and pantethine. And so having this sort of one-stop shop, as to speak, where there's one brand catered for each sort of organ system, but applying that sort of functional health mechanistic perspective to the formulation, as opposed to just throwing everything that you can possibly into the capsule and hoping something works. That there's a thought process behind each thing. Like even liver stack has choline and inositol to help with fatty acids flowing across the liver and being cleared into the small intestine. So you're trying to offset fatty liver disease with fatty acids building up in the liver. You have ox bile and tudke, again, for biliary control and to ensure that the bile, the viscosity of the bile stays normal and we're not getting crystallized cholesterol forming. And then we have DIM and calcium D-glucarate, DIM to increase phase 1 estrogen metabolism so that we're pushing it over then for conjugation with the calcium D-glucarate for excretion. And so applying that sort of mechanistic biochemistry to formulating the supplements themselves are all dosed based on what you sort of see in research, as opposed to, oh, well, Tudke helps with bile flow. So let's put 250 milligrams. And we know like the sort of clinical level is way over 800, 900 milligrams. One of the big things, like when I joined Supplement Needs, even for formulating with Lee, was if we're going to do these products, they're not going to be cheap. They're going to be like a premium level that the consumer knows first and foremost that it's dosed as high as it can possibly be and be as efficacious as it can possibly be. Because to me, it didn't make sense like someone thinking that they're taking 250 milligrams of Tudke is going to have the same extent as the clinical dose, when supplement companies are selling you the 250 milligrams of Tudke at probably the same margin as where it would go at 800, 900 milligrams. So you start to see that supplement industry is very built on margins and consumer control. That, of course, every business has to be profitable, but the profit wasn't really the main driver behind these supplements. It was the quality and the efficacy. And then you start to see, obviously, blood control and blood management. You start to see improvement of blood results from how these supplements were designed, that you then, you have a quality line that's trusted by thousands of people, that you're not relying on trying to make cheap money that eventually someone turns around and goes, well, your products aren't dosed right. And then that company folds because you just cash up and get out as quick as possible. So the whole idea was that we'd build a line, and cater, sort of organ by organ and look at the dysfunction towards health and how can we optimize each aspect. And this was more so for enhanced bodybuilders, and then I started to lead more into, like general health. And now we have quite a lot of private medical clinics within the UK who are recommending our supplements before medicine in line with, lifestyle management. Yeah. Because of what they've seen in terms of the results. And so, like I said, when I sort of last year came to the head that I could continue to be a chemical engineer, but with sort of the growth and how things were sort of progressing online and my sort of voice within the industry, it just made sense that to take that sort of leap and leave my sort of, I guess, cushioned career that I'd been in for so long and move my focus into what I was doing as a hobby with my full-time career to become like this full-time passion. Yeah. Because of the effects that I was seeing personally, just as again, like a hobby or just a side interest. And I always laughed at when people often said in the past, you should always pursue your passions. It's only when you see that, when you're involved with something from a hobby perspective and it brings you great passion, why shouldn't you not chase after that as a career? And we were on holiday for 2 weeks there with our young boys. It was our first family holiday, and since our first child was born. And that was the first time I said to my wife, I've got no like holiday dread, where we got to like the last 3 days, you're like, I have to go home because I have to, go back to work, whatever. It was like, I actually can't wait to go home and get back to what I was doing, because for 2 weeks, I just ignored my phone and ignored my laptop. Whereas with my previous career, I would have kept on top of what was going on, even when away, so that there was no surprises when I got back. That just that switching off and then realizing, I've got no dread. I've actually, I love my job. And to say that, with confidence and to really appreciate it is definitely something that I think everyone should come to a point where, don't just do a job for the sake of it. find something that you are passionate about, and then try and pursue it as much as possible.
Yeah, I think it's great when you can make that happen. It's funny. My friend and I, we each have our own practice, and we joke about like the Sunday scaries because like my Monday is a 12-hour day, and that's the longest day of the week for me, and then it gets gradually better. And I'm very fortunate to have my career, and I really enjoy it. But there's definitely something to be said for going from like a Sunday kind of hanging out, and then it's like 12 hours of patient care. It's a lot, and
Yeah.
I'm actually taking a full vacation in a week, which will be the first time since having my practice that I'm stepping away for a whole week. So we'll see how I do with it mentally. But it's nice to be in a position where you can enjoy actually going back to it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And just when you realize that when you take that break, how passionate you are to get back to that level of work. And again, just from that like type of personality in the past, I would have never done that. Sort of, I'm not okay. I have my phone on holiday, and it's my own personal use. But in terms of work emails or interactions, I think I checked my emails twice one evening when the boys went to bed early, and we were just chilling out on our balcony. I had a quick look and then put the laptop away. Didn't entertain it any further. It was more so moving like mails into need to reply when back folders. So I had a nice list for when I got back. That you appreciate what you're doing at that current time.
That's awesome, man. Well, of course, I'll have a link. I'm sure there's a nice website for the supplements and everything. I'll have a link to your Instagram as well.
Amazing. If anyone wants to go, like the website is supplementneeds.co.uk, and I'll give you my discount code is Dr. Dean, so they'll save 10% off the whole website with that.
Awesome. So other than the website and your Instagram, anywhere else people should find your stuff?
We started an education platform last year. We're coming up to 1 year, and that was SN Education. That was the education branch of Supplement Needs, and that stemmed from originally just to discuss the products, to put just a consumer resource to educate on what the products do. So if anyone is listening and you want to see what CV Stack does or Liver Stack does, SN Education has product videos where I talk in depth of what this ingredient does and why potentially you might take it. But also from an education perspective, where I put together a team of what I consider experts or educators that have high level qualifications in different areas like training, biomechanics, chiropractic, female health, myself with sort of my chemical and pharmacology and functional medicine and drugs. Just a resource that every month there's 7 educators, and we each produce 2 pieces of content each month, where it's like delivered in a lecture format. So we're trying to bring almost like a higher level education platform where someone can learn about steroids or about female health in like a lecture setting. So you're almost upskilling yourself rather than someone just talking face to face with a camera. It's more, it is more professional in that you're following along with a lecture and you're taking notes, and rather than listening to me just talk to the camera for 5 minutes.
Cool, man. That's awesome. So yeah, we'll have, is there like, that's a website as well, or is it part of the main?
That's a website, sneducation.co.uk.
Cool. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thank you very much, Dave.